It was an ordinary day in the small town of Ridgewood. The kind of day that would typically be forgotten in the blur of daily life. Children were playing in the yards, the birds were singing, and the hum of neighborhood chatter filled the air. But for one child, that day was far from ordinary. His world was about to shift in a way he could never have anticipated. The little boy was sitting on his grandmother's porch, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. His grandmother, a woman of kindness and grace, had always been his protector. She was the one who'd listened to his stories of monsters under the bed and chased away the shadows from his nightmares. But now, as he looked at her bruised face, his heart shattered. His grandmother had been hurt, and there was no one to stand up for her. At least, that's what he thought, until he saw them. There's a moment in every child's life when they realize the world isn't as safe as they once thought. It's a moment when they look to the people around them for protection and find that those very people may not always be able to shield them. But there are other moments, moments of power and community, when a child discovers that there are forces in the world bigger than their fears, bigger than their doubts, and far stronger than they could ever imagine. That moment came for the boy when he ran to the street, tears streaming down his face. His voice trembled as he cried out, "He hit my grandma." His words, simple but powerful, carried a weight beyond his years. He didn't understand the complexities of justice, nor did he know the consequences of his actions. All he knew was that someone had hurt the one person in the world who mattered most to him. And in that instant, he knew he had to do something about it. What happened next was something no one saw coming. The boy's cry didn't fall on deaf ears. The neighborhood, usually a quiet and peaceful place, suddenly sprang to life. People who had never spoken to each other before, people who had only exchanged polite nods in passing, began to move with purpose. The door of one house opened, then another. People emerged from their homes, not out of curiosity, but out of concern. The most unexpected figures in this unfolding drama, however, were the bikers. A group of men and women who were known to be tough, known to ride their motorcycles through town with a rumble that could shake the walls of any building. They were not the type of people you would expect to come to the aid of a child or his grandmother. They were, in the eyes of many, a symbol of rebellion and defiance. But in that moment, they became something else entirely, heroes. The first bike appeared at the end of the street, its engine roaring to life like a lion's growl. The rest of the gang followed, a line of motorcycles that seemed to stretch on forever. Their leather jackets gleamed in the sun, their patches and insignias proudly displayed. They parked right outside the boy's door, their bikes casting long shadows on the pavement. The sound of the engines faded, but the presence of the riders didn't. They stood tall, intimidating to some, but to the child, they were something different, protectors. In a flash, the bikers dismounted. There was no hesitation in their actions. They didn't need to discuss what they were about to do. Their faces were set with a determination that matched the boy's own grief. The leader of the group, a man known as Big Red, stepped forward. His rough hands, weathered by years of hard work, reached out to the child. "Where is he, kid?" Big Red's voice was deep and steady, yet it carried an unmistakable sense of urgency. The boy pointed down the street, his small finger trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "He lives there. The man who hurt Grandma." Big Red nodded. Without a word, he turned to his crew. The group of bikers moved as one, a collective force of strength and solidarity. There was no need for violence. There was no need for intimidation. All they needed was to stand in the gap, to send a message that this was a place of safety, not one of fear. They marched to the house of the man who had struck the boy's grandmother. It was a small, nondescript house, tucked away at the edge of town. The man who lived there had a reputation for causing trouble, but no one had ever dared challenge him. He had always been able to intimidate his neighbors with his harsh words and threats. But not today. Today, he was going to face the consequences of his actions. The door to the man's house opened slowly, and there he stood, a man much older than the bikers but with a look of arrogance that made him seem taller. He sneered at the sight of the group, his eyes narrowing as if he was about to make a snide remark. But the words died on his lips when he saw the size and the intensity of the group before him. Big Red didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You hit a child's grandmother," he said, his voice calm but firm. "That's not something we take lightly. The man scoffed. "And what are you going to do about it? A bunch of bikers trying to play the hero." Big Red didn't flinch. "We're not playing anything. We're here because someone needs to protect the vulnerable. And if you can't understand that, then maybe you need a reminder of what it means to respect others." The bikers stood in silence, their presence alone making the man uneasy. The weight of their gaze, the strength of their stance, sent a clear message. He wasn't going to get away with it. Not today, not with them standing there. It wasn't about violence, though. It wasn't about trying to teach the man a lesson through force. It was about sending a message. No one hurts the people who can't defend themselves, and no one gets away with it. The bikers were not there to escalate the situation but to ensure that it didn't go any further. They were there to make sure that the boy and his grandmother would be safe, and that the community would know that justice had been served. The man, realizing he was outmatched, not by force, but by integrity and unity, suddenly lost the bravado that had fueled his actions. He knew that no matter how hard he tried to stand his ground, he would never win in this situation. He looked at the bikers and, for the first time, saw them not as enemies but as protectors. His shoulders slumped, and his eyes darted to the ground. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to. He trailed off, the words lost in his throat. Big Red nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Don't make promises you can't keep, but make sure you never do that again." The bikers didn't stick around after that. They had done what needed to be done. The message was clear, and the balance had been restored. As they returned to their motorcycles, the boy watched them, a sense of relief flooding through him. He had seen these men as outsiders before, maybe even as threats. But now, they were his heroes. They had given him something far more precious than the protection of his grandmother. They had given him hope. As the bikers roared off into the distance, the child's tears began to subside. The world, though still imperfect, was a little safer. And as the sun began to set over the small town of Ridgewood, the boy knew that, no matter what happened next, he would never again feel as helpless as he had before. It's easy to judge people by their appearances, to assume that we know who they are based on their outward actions or choices. But sometimes, the real heroes are the ones who show up when we least expect it, who take action not out of a need for recognition, but out of a sense of responsibility to others. The bikers didn't need to help the child. They didn't owe him anything. But they did it because it was the right thing to do. In a world that often feels divided, where people are quick to turn away or look past the suffering of others, we can learn something from the unexpected. We can learn that sometimes, the toughest people are also the most compassionate. And that it only takes one act of kindness, one show of strength and solidarity, to remind us all that we are not alone in this world. As the child sat on the porch that evening, his grandmother beside him, he knew that the world still had good people in it. People who would protect, who would fight for what was right, and who would make sure that no one ever had to face injustice alone. And for that, he would always be grateful.